It started as a barbed wire fence, dividing us, imprisoning its people. The very image of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall.
Raise your right hand.
Memphis, Tennessee, March 1958.
I, Elvis Presley, do solemnly swear that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the United States of America.
Give us a room with a view of the beautiful Rhine.
Elvis Presley hits West Germany.
Beautiful Rhine.
The well-known guitarist has come to bolster NATO forces, in particular a 3rd U.S. Armored Division tank unit.
I got those hot 2, 3, 4 occupation GI Blue.
West Germany was NATO's front line along the Iron Curtain. Since 1955, the Americans had been training a new West German army. Some thought that could mean a German finger on NATO's nuclear trigger. German rearmament brought back nightmares for many Europeans, above all for the Russians. The new weaponry alarmed East Germany, the German Democratic Republic.
Die DDR hat ja nun versucht, verschiedene Angebote zu machen, eine Nuklear...
The GDR made various offers to prevent the nuclear armament of West Germany,
vorzubeugen. Sie hat da
but it found no response, no echo.
und darum fühlte sich die DDR...
The GDR felt directly threatened by tactical nuclear weapons.
taktischen Atomwaffen fühlte sich bedroht.
It accepted that the Soviet army, stationed on GDR territory, also should arm itself with tactical nuclear weapons.
Mit taktischen Atomwaffen.
Berlin, deep in East German territory, was under the joint occupation of the former wartime allies. Now in West Berlin, 12,000 British, American and French soldiers were surrounded by 500,000 Soviet and East German troops. Western rights of access were protected by four-power agreement. Each day, thousands moved freely between the Soviet and Western sectors. Berlin's open border gave East Germans access to the glittering West, which Soviet and East German leaders wanted to end.
West-Berlin immer gefährlicher wurde für die Existenz der DDR und damit auch für die Existenz des Sozialismus. Und daraus
West Berlin was becoming increasingly dangerous to the existence of the GDR and the existence of socialism. Khrushchev proposed to create a free city of Berlin with special rights of its own, with its own foreign policy, its own police, and its own symbolic foreign forces.
Khrushchev thought that some pressures should be put on the Americans, and the obvious place was West Berlin. So that this was a sort of shock therapy on the part of Khrushchev, I would say.
In November 1958, the West rejected Khrushchev's Berlin proposals. Khrushchev now offered East German leader Walter Ulbricht a peace treaty. It threatened Western rights in Berlin.
He said that unless agreement were reached, that Berlin would be turned over to the East Germans within 6 months. We regarded that as an ultimatum. Eisenhower felt that the Soviets were doing something that was not really in their interest. His view was that if there were to be actual conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, it would move quickly to large-scale, all-out conflict where everything would be drawn into it, and that was the danger, that was the risk.
A new red threat to West Berlin. Khrushchev's demand that the United States, France, and Britain agree to end the four-power pact governing West Berlin, turning it over to Red East Germany, hints a new and major crisis. The Western powers reacted strongly, affirming their determination to keep the city free. It's an outpost.
American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, seeking common ground for a bargain over Berlin, consulted America's allies. But talks between the West and the Soviet Union led nowhere.
The attempt to find a compromise with the Soviets was where we began to get into serious trouble, because any concessions that you made to the Soviets from the Western side would be an erosion of the Western position there. And the Soviets themselves were committed to a situation in Berlin that the Allies could not tolerate. So we were already, I mean, there was no possible outcome, a negotiated outcome that was possible.
But the talks persuaded Khrushchev to shelve his Berlin ultimatum and head west. He chose the world's largest aircraft for the journey, Soviet-built. In September 1959, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev became the first Soviet leader to visit America.
Khrushchev got what he wanted, which was a visit to the United States and treatment as an equal, and an exchange with Eisenhower, which gave him, I think, a fair idea that probably if he continued without too much provocative actions on the ground, he could get more and more out of the Western side.
In talks with Eisenhower, a new spirit of cooperation eased the crisis. But Khrushchev's hopes for a Cold War truce only lasted 6 months. On the eve of a grand peacemaking summit in Paris, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down in Soviet airspace. Khrushchev was enraged.
Но для этого что требуется? Не летайте вы в Советский Союз, не летайте вы в социалистические страны. Уважайте суверенитет и знайте границу. Не знаете границу? Ударим. Ударим, обучим уму-разуму.
The summit collapsed before it had even begun. In 1959, East Germany celebrated 10 years of socialist achievement. Walter Ulbricht, party leader, boasted of rapid industrial progress and of a socialist democracy that Germany had never known before. Official films portrayed a paradise for workers and peasants. The reality was shortages and chaos. Private farms were forcibly collectivized, and the state's resources poured into heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods. Obediently, East Germany copied the Soviet model, down to thought control of its people.
Und so turnten dann 400 Einwohner Leipzigs gemeinsam mit Walter Ulbricht.
East Germany, its leaders claimed, was succeeding through sheer willpower. But in spite of hard work and enthusiasm, only Soviet support kept the economy going. East Germany could not compete with the swelling prosperity of the West.
The people in the East looked toward the West. That's what I might say, longing. They would have liked to have the same comforts, the same goods, the same chances. And they saw in what was called socialism at the time a system that demanded of them sacrifices with nothing but promises for the future. And as long as the borders were open, it was relatively easy to get there. All you had to do is board a subway, and you were in another world. And it was really a crazy system. Imagine you go from socialism, in quotation marks, to capitalism in 2 minutes.
Every month, thousands of East Germans fled across the open Berlin border and took refuge in the West. Most refugees were young and skilled, but their departure was bleeding the East German economy to death.
Foreman in a plant in the East wouldn't know how many workers he still would have the next day because part of his working force had left him, had left the East, had left the system in order to go over there. And of course, in West Germany, they made every effort that people who came from the East would get jobs and would get comfortable existence.
As his people drained away, Ulbricht became anxious. He urged Khrushchev to recognize East Germany as a sovereign state with control over its own borders. Khrushchev, outwardly sympathetic, played for time.
Diese Idee eines separaten Friedens mit der DDR wurde mehr lanciert von Ulbricht.
The idea of a separate peace treaty with the GDR was put forward mainly by Ulbricht, who wanted to bind the GDR into fixed treaties and link it politically with other countries. But Khrushchev argued that a separate peace treaty would intensify the Cold War.
Den Kalten Krieg nicht entschärft, sondern im Gegenteil verschärft.
Ulbricht argued that there could be no lasting peace in Europe until both German states, East and West, were recognized. But Moscow was in no hurry. The German question must wait until after the American presidential election. John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961. He had campaigned for a more vigorous American foreign policy.
I don't think the communists are about to collapse. I believe we have to build strength. We have to stand for freedom. We have to demonstrate some vigor in our foreign policy.
Kennedy agreed to meet Khrushchev at Vienna in June 1961. The president arrived bruised. His invasion of Castro's Cuba at the Bay of Pigs 6 weeks before had failed. Khrushchev concluded that Kennedy was weak. He had decided to bully the new president.
He felt that this young president, unexperienced specifically after he has a fiasco at Bay of Pigs, is not very strong position. He said, already so many years passed, Western countries do nothing about Germany and the peace treaty and about specifically West Berlin. So I'm going to press this issue very strongly with the meeting with the new president.
What Khrushchev kept saying was that we surround all those troops you have in West Berlin, and we take West Berlin anytime we want to. And Kennedy's reply to him was, well, that's as may be, but we fought the Second World War, and they're there because of the Second World War by right.
He became very emotional, very angry. This young fellow doesn't want to discuss with me the issue which is very important. And this make it very angry, and really it influenced his attitude. So it's he has a mixed feeling about. From one thing, he accepted he is tough, but from the other, he said that he is not wise enough. Doesn't understand quite well the foreign policy.
The meeting was unproductive, and the longer it went on, the more that became apparent. It was difficult. It was disappointing. It left us with a Berlin crisis that was still active and on which no progress had been made.
At the summer White House in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, Defense Secretary McNamara and Secretary of State Dean Rusk confer with President Kennedy on the increasingly ominous words and actions from Moscow. Premier Khrushchev's increase in arms...
Khrushchev had renewed his ultimatum and increased the Soviet arms budget. Kennedy asked his advisers to list America's military options.
It was conceivable there would only be two alternatives: surrender or use of nuclear force, which might well have brought destruction of both East and West. So the President was very anxious to find a middle course.
In July, Kennedy asked Congress for extra defense funds and called reservists to arms.
The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin. For the choice of peace or war is largely theirs, not ours.
Of all the presidents in this Cold War period, I think the nuclear issue bore hardest on Kennedy. He took it very seriously, and he was sometimes afraid that the good Lord had put him on earth to start a nuclear war, really. And he was not about to get out of Berlin, no matter what it took.
It would be a mistake for others to look upon Berlin because of its location as a tempting target. The United States is there. The United Kingdom and France are there. The pledge of NATO is there. And the people of Berlin are there. It is as secure in that sense as the rest of us. For we cannot separate its safety from our own.
So he made very clear that he is going to defend status of West Berlin and the presence of their troops there. But when he mentioned this one, we noticed one thing, that in his speech he mentioned that the line between West and East Berlin are a line of freedom. And he didn't say anything about the freedom of the movement across this line, East Berlin and West Berlin.
It is a fact that we were not going to fight about what the Soviets did on their side of Berlin, and that it is quite likely that Khrushchev was helped to understand that American position by the July speech.
As the Berlin crisis darkened, the flow of refugees became a torrent. Fear rose that East Germany might collapse, pitching NATO and Soviet forces into conflict.
Everybody knew that something is going to happen. Not necessarily only from the atmosphere, but for weeks, thousands and thousands of people have come across. And everybody realized that in some way or another, East Germany will have to react.
By July, East Germans were desperate. They begged the Soviets to let them stem the flow.
Заявление Ульбрихта в беседе с нашим послом говорило только о следующем.
Ulbricht indicated to our ambassador that they were fed up with the promises we'd given them to sign a peace treaty and take control. Promises which had been made in 1958, 59, 60, and again in 1961. Ulbricht said that all these promises did was to stimulate the population drain. Either we had to act or stop talking about it.
East German border controls were intensified. Undetected by Western intelligence, Khrushchev and Ulbricht were planning harsher measures.
Sometime later, a reply came back from Moscow that Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev agrees to the closing of the border with West Germany and with West Berlin, and suggests the necessary preparations should be carried out.
Der Nationalen Volksarmee, der Volkspolizei
The National People's Army, the People's Police, the Customs State Security, the Transport Authority were all brought together in the Berlin area. They were put under strict observation, and they were not allowed to telephone their families. They didn't even have a telephone. For 4 to 6 weeks, they worked in total isolation on the preparations.
On August the 12th, Soviet and East German forces were mobilized.
At 23 hours, we were given our orders and told that at 24 hours, the border with West Berlin would be closed by military force. All the soldiers were fully armed. The People's Militia had automatic pistols and machine guns, any weapons they could get hold of.
By early morning, East German troops were ready, lined up in battle order along the sector border. It was Berlin's last hour as one city. On the morning of Sunday, August 13th, Berliners woke to find a divided city. Teams of workers under armed guards started erecting a barbed wire barrier through the center.
Khrushchev, preparing to this event, would have done everything to minimize, or rather to prevent, any military conflict between us and the United States and Western countries. Specifically, Ulbricht was told by Khrushchev 2 days before this was happening that he, Ulbricht, could build this wall, but he should not infringe even an inch of American and Western rights. So we expect very strong reaction, but we didn't expect any military clash between us.
The barrier split Berlin. Families were torn apart.
My father actually woke me up and said, you know, they closed the border. It was incomprehensible. You know, it was so strange. And then my mother came in crying, and my elder sister, and we were thinking, you know, how do we get my sister back? My sister that summer had stayed with my aunt just outside of East Berlin. So we all took the S-Bahn, and it was an absolute chaos. It was terrible. People crying, shouting. Some were frightened, some were angry. And I just remember I was so frightened. I thought, we never see my sister. She's lost, so to speak.
A pitiful old woman timidly walked up the 3 stairs to one of these trapos and said, when is the next train to West Berlin? Because all these people hadn't heard. The first news was at midnight over the East Berlin radio, and these people came to the station thinking they could go to West Berlin. And I'll never forget the sneering tone in which this trapo said to her, none of that anymore, Grandma, you're all sitting in a mousetrap now.
Die Menschen waren ganz anders drüben, haben zwar geschimpft auf uns.
The people were swearing at us. We felt we were simply doing our duty, but we were getting scolded from all sides. The West Berliners yelled at us, and the Eastern demonstrators yelled at us. We were standing there in the middle. There was the barbed wire, there were us guards, West Berliners, East Berliners. For a young person, it was terrible.
The anger of West Berliners boiled over. They demonstrated against the division of their city. They could not believe that the Western Allies would allow the barriers to remain. the demonstrations continued, but the West offered little protest. Mayor Willy Brandt tried to calm the crowds. He feared bloodshed if they attacked the barriers. The Allies were unsure how to react. Western rights had not been challenged.
Erstmal waren wir wütend. Dann waren wir enttäuscht.
We were outraged.
Der Bürgermeister hatte nicht mal geschafft,
and also disappointed.
Die Kommandanten dazu zu bewegen.
The mayor didn't manage to persuade the Allied commanders to make even a small protest.
Auszusprechen.
People were not clear what exactly was going on. It was almost 12 hours before it really registered that this was going to be a total sealing of the inner sector borders. Nobody was quite sure what to do about the subject, what exactly was the scope of it. The focus of all of the planners had been on the threat, the possible necessity of having to take military action to block a Soviet move on Berlin. And here suddenly everybody was relieved to find out that the Soviets had found a way to resolve their problem with the refugees in a way that did not affect Allied rights.
For the Allies, the closed border stabilized the tense Berlin situation. It was ordinary Berliners and their families who paid the price. In East Berlin, one soldier saw his last chance to escape.
Dann war die 14 Uhr, habe ich meine Gruppe eingeteilt.
At 2 o'clock, I assigned tasks to my soldiers. I was in front and I spread the others out so that it wouldn't look suspicious. Nobody noticed anything. From 2 until 4 o'clock, I was thinking about the situation and wondering what was the right decision. I would have to leave my parents and my sister. Finally, I took the decision. I jumped over the barbed wire at 4 o'clock. Then I was in the West, and they received me with a great cheer. I was the first.
Three days later, concrete blocks began to replace the barbed wire. Along the sector boundaries rose the Berlin Wall, carving the city in two. In West Berlin, morale was low. Confidence in Allied protection crumbled. Mayor Willy Brandt sent an angry letter to President Kennedy demanding action.
Die Idee war eben, nachdem auch in Washington nicht passierte, die ganze
The idea was, since there had been no reaction in Washington,
den Präsidenten darauf aufmerksam zu machen,
we had to make it clear to the president
ein Einbruch
that there might be a breakdown in morale, a loss of trust,
Einbruch, und dass hier
something more than just a protest had to be done.
man mehr als Protest machen müsste.
I think it's probably putting it mildly to say he was furious. Kennedy felt that he had shown that he was prepared to go to the brink of war, maybe even over the brink of war to defend Berlin, and here he was being criticized for doing nothing by a, as somebody put it, a mere mayor.
But Kennedy realized that a gesture was needed, a sign that America still meant to defend West Berlin. He ordered a show of force. An American troop convoy was sent to Berlin up the Autobahn across East Germany. The plan was to test East German reaction and to reaffirm Allied access rights to Berlin. The Americans were stopped and counted. They waited and were let through. The troops arrived safely. America's Vice President Lyndon Johnson flew to the city as Kennedy's personal representative. He was accompanied by General Lucius Clay, hero of the Berlin airlift. Johnson brought a message from President Kennedy.
He wants you to know that the pledge he has given to the freedom of West Berlin and to the rights of Western access to Berlin is firm.
In the east, people risked death to flee through the last chinks in the barrier.
All of a sudden, I saw my friend running, and I said to myself, "Oh my God, you're not going to make it." And I couldn't run. I turned into a pillar of salt. And an elderly woman said to me, "Go girl, run too. You're still young, run." So I just started running. My friend had hurt her face, but I'd only ripped my sweater. Apart from that, I wasn't hurt. We were incredibly happy. We laughed and cried. We just made it.
Many more made an impulsive dive for freedom.
Und eines Tages kam nicht nach Hause.
One day he didn't return home. I was waiting and waiting. He didn't come during the night or the next day, and I thought, what has happened? And then my brother-in-law came. "Don't you know," he said, "he's in the West." My whole world collapsed. I had to collect his things from work. It was like collecting a dead person.
Later, Heinz Carstens helped his wife to escape. Where the border ran down the middle of the street, windows overlooked the west. Helping people escape became a routine assignment for West Berlin's fire brigade.
Nachher so, das spielte sich so ein, dass Leute springen wollten und Türme.
It became the custom that people who wanted to escape, people who wanted to leave, would throw little pieces of paper out of the windows into Bernauer Strasse. The number of the building, the floor, the window. Second or third window was written on it, and the time, for example 10 o'clock, that they wanted to jump.
Here are perhaps the most dramatic scenes ever to come out of Berlin. Tossing belongings from the window of an apartment overlooking the western border and freedom, an escapee is prepared to jump to safety into a net held by police and firemen of West Berlin. A rescue episode that is even more extraordinary. An attempt is being made by sympathetic Germans to assure the escape of a brave woman. While communist police try to pull her back through the window, below there is freedom's grip. A blood-chilling sequence that the News of the Day camera follows to its dramatic conclusion. She's safe at last.
The East Germans blocked even this last loophole. People swam lakes and canals, clung under trains, hid in cars, climbed barriers under fire. Hundreds failed. Many died. Despite the human suffering, East Germany justified the wall as a bulwark of peace.
When the barbed wire was put up, the main argument was that peace had been saved. It wasn't a question of domestic difficulties. Ulbricht drew a veil of silence over the economic problems. They talked always of the anti-fascist barrier. That's how it was officially described, the protective bulwark.
They did it as a necessity. And I thought, what kind of system is it that can only exist by keeping them with force in their own bailiwick? And the wall was the actual symbol of a defeat, of inferiority.
Escapes went on. Killings went on. Telephone lines were cut. Now the two cities could no longer talk. At the few Allied crossing points, tension was high. In October, an American diplomat was stopped by East German guards as he was crossing to visit the theater in East Berlin. The Americans decided to make an issue of it and assert their right to free movement in Berlin. Lucius Clay was back on the scene.
Clay's calculation was that the Soviets were responsible for East Berlin, not the East Germans, and he was determined that the Soviets would recognize their responsibility there.
To test East German reaction, Clay ordered armed American soldiers to escort vehicles back and forth across the border at Checkpoint Charlie.
He once told me, he said, I learned early in the game of dealing with the Russians, if the Russians understand one thing, and that's force, that's strength. You must never negotiate or deal with the Russians without having a position of strength.
To underline his point, Clay moved tanks up to the checkpoint. The Russians brought up their tanks and guns. The two sides faced each other barrel to barrel.
The telephone rang in the command post. He said, let me speak to General Clay. I said, he's not here. Who is this? He said, this is the military police officer at Checkpoint Charlie. He said, holy Christ, he said, the Russians have rolled in here in force. He said, they've got tanks. He said, the balloon's getting ready to go up. He said, the defecation is about to hit the fan.
The situation was dangerous. The tanks stood facing each other. Our tank crews were told to exercise restraint, to give no grounds for provocation.
The dead seriousness of it became more intense with each hour. The Western forces went on alert, Strategic Air Command went on alert, NATO went on alert, troops were being cranked up around the world, and one never knew if the intensity of the situation in Berlin escalated, where would be the next sore point.
Khrushchev ordered the commander of Soviet troops in Germany that if the West used force, they should respond with force.
Я как раз сидел в генеральном штабе, когда проходил съезд.
I had a phone by one ear receiving information from Soviet military headquarters in Germany.
Информацию из группы войск Германии.
The other phone was connected to the Kremlin. As soon as I got the information, I reported to the Kremlin what was happening at Friedrichstrasse.
На КПП у Фридрихштрассе.
President Kennedy had sent a message to Khrushchev through a new private channel that had been established only a month earlier for a back channel between the White House and Khrushchev, and that President Kennedy had asked Khrushchev to take the first move.
The Americans sent a message. It said, "In order for us to move our tanks without losing face, you should move your tanks back to a certain distance." Our tanks stood 200 meters from the Americans.
The lead Soviet tank cranked up his engine and backed up some 5 or 10 meters, and we received instructions to have the American tanks to withdraw exactly the same distance.
It wasn't a good enough reason to start a war. Khrushchev himself said, "We're not unleashing a third world war because of Berlin." The Americans realized that too.
The soldiers pulled back, but the wall remained. The East Germans built it higher and backed it with fences, tripwires, and tank traps. During the first year, 50 Germans died trying to cross to the west. One of them was 18-year-old Peter Fechter.
The Americans gathered, the soldiers gathered on one side, not doing anything. And on the other side, the GDR, the Vorpost, the police there, was standing on their side, not doing anything. And this young man was huddled. I remember he was lying like an S shape. And first he screamed, he cried, he shouted for help. And as the hours went on, his voice got weaker and weaker. It was so heart-rending that in the middle of nowhere was a human being dying, and two groups was facing each other, too worried to act because they didn't know what the other one was going to do. It was really horrible. He was just standing there and you thought, he's just dying and you can't do anything. I mean, I've never been in that situation before, neither after, where you actually see a person dying and you can't do anything. And I'm sure everyone else around me felt the same.
The wall was the supreme symbol of the Cold War's cruelty and Europe's division. Its message was a bitter one. Whatever happened beyond that line, the West might lament, but would not interfere.
The wall was a way out, really, for Khrushchev. And although the Berlin affair continued to be discussed, it was no longer in a state of crisis as it had been before the wall.
In 1963, President Kennedy visited West Berlin.
Is indivisible. And when one man is enslaved, all are not free. When all are free, then we can look forward to that day when this city will be joined as one, and this country and this great continent of Europe in a peaceful and hopeful globe. When that day finally comes, as it will, the people of West Berlin can take sober satisfaction in the fact that they were in the front lines for almost 2 decades. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
A war appeared imminent. A first strike might take place at any time. I said to myself, if Cuba is in such an unfortunate war, we will disappear from the map.
Robert Kennedy came to me and said, Mr. Ambassador, the situation is very tense. Your missiles have just shot down our plane. Our generals demand that we retaliate. If we start bombing, you will fight back. What can we do?
It was a perfectly beautiful night, as fall nights are fortunate. I walked out of the President's Oval Office, and as I walked out, I thought I might never live to see another Saturday night.
Throughout the 1940s and 50s, the Caribbean island of Cuba had been America's playground. Beaches, booze, and casinos. Havana had it all. Cuba's land and industry were owned almost entirely by American corporations.
We consider part of the United States practically, just a wonderful little country over there that was of no danger to anybody. As a matter of fact, was a rather important economic asset to the United States.
Cuba's leader, Fulgencio Batista, was a brutal dictator. His people were turning against him. After years of guerrilla fighting in the mountains, a charismatic 33-year-old lawyer, Fidel Castro, entered Havana on the 8th of January 1959.
The triumph of the revolution was an example of order. There was no looting. No one was dragged along the streets. There were no murders, no crimes. There was perfect order.
In this perfect order, over 500 members of the former regime were accused of crimes against the people, tried and executed. Fearing the rise of a new dictator, thousands fled to exile in the United States. But to most people, Castro was a hero.
La revolución prometió empleo a la población
The revolution promised to provide jobs for the people. It promised honesty in the administration, which had never existed in Cuba. There were health programs which had never existed before. Education programs which had never existed before.
Most important of all, Castro nationalized millions of acres of land held by American companies and gave it to the people. Eager to tell the world of his revolution, Castro flew to New York to speak at the United Nations. President Eisenhower was too busy to see him. But Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, was delighted to embrace a new revolutionary and offered him economic assistance.
Cuba decided to buy oil from the Soviet Union, which would be cheaper. The country could also get credit from the Soviet Union, who were willing to help us. But the American companies refused to refine the oil.
With nowhere to refine the Soviet oil, Castro was faced with economic disaster. He sent in his militia and took over the foreign refineries in Cuba. America's retaliation was swift.
At his White House press conference, President Eisenhower announces that Cuba's assigned share of the United States sugar market has been cut by 95% in reply to what I call Fidel Castro's deliberate policy of hostility.
As tension mounted, Castro nationalized a further $1 billion worth of American investments. An irate President Eisenhower declared a complete trade embargo and ordered the CIA to recruit Cuban exiles. They would be trained to destroy Castro's regime.
Government agencies of the United States began training people to bomb Cuba and to burn the sugarcane fields. They used small planes with incendiary devices to set fire to the fields. It was very serious. This was the only wealth we had.
They carried out a dirty war against our country. Guerrilla units were active in every province, even in Havana.
Over 100 people died when La Cubra, a freighter unloading arms and ammunition from Belgium, exploded in Havana harbor. CIA sabotage was suspected, but never proved. Castro turned to the Soviet Union for help.
Perhaps he might have taken a different line had the Americans been more mild towards him than they actually were. The Cold War was in its full bloom, so whatever was unpleasant to the Americans was welcomed in this country, and vice versa, I would say.
At a secret base in the Guatemalan jungle, American CIA agents had been training Cuban exiles to invade Cuba. This, they thought, would be the impetus for the Cuban people to rise up and overthrow Castro. The plan was presented to the new president, John F. Kennedy.
Kennedy felt that a plan that he had inherited, under which a band of Cuban exiles were to liberate their own country, was one he could hardly turn his back on. Surely the United States should help get rid of a communist dictatorship in our hemisphere.
The CIA badly misled the new president promising him an easy victory and an end to the Cuban problem. Kennedy agreed to the invasion, but demanded crucial changes to hide America's involvement. Just 3 days before the planned invasion, Kennedy denied any possibility of American intervention.
There will not be, under any conditions, be an intervention in Cuba by United States Armed Forces. And this government will do everything it possibly can, and I think it can meet its responsibilities to make sure that there are no Americans involved in any actions inside Cuba.
As Kennedy spoke, the invasion force was gathering. An advance wave of American bombers planned to destroy Castro's air force on the ground. The president, worried that this might reveal Washington's role, ordered the operation scaled down. On April the 15th, 1961, just 6 American bombers, disguised in the colors of the Cuban Air Force, took off from Nicaragua for a crucial attack on Cuban airfields. But with so few bombers, only 3 Cuban planes were destroyed. 7 civilians were killed. As they buried those who had died, Castro, seeking Soviet support, finally declared that the revolution was socialist.
Porque lo que no pueden perdonarnos los imperialistas es que estemos aquí y que hayamos hecho una revolución socialista en las propias narices de los Estados Unidos.
Continuamos preparando. Resistir nada.
We prepared ourselves to resist an invasion against all the forces we knew the Americans had at their disposal.
The following day, just 1,500 exiles, equipped with American arms and ammunition, arrived at the Bay of Pigs, 125 miles to the south of Havana.
Éramos los hombres más felices del mundo.
We were the happiest men in the world because we had the opportunity to return to Cuba, our homeland, to fight to rescue freedom and democracy so that our country could be for all Cubans.
American planes were to protect the invasion force as they hit the beach, but Kennedy, now faced with international condemnation for the initial bombing, cancelled the air support. Castro's remaining air force quickly destroyed the ships carrying vital ammunition supplies. Mistakenly believing that this was a full-scale American invasion, Cuba mobilized all its forces.
Los peores momentos eran los iniciales, cuando teníamos poca información.
The worst moments were at the beginning. We didn't have much information about the enemy. We didn't know if they were 1,000, 3,000 or 10,000. We didn't know what types of weapons they might have. We didn't know if this was a total invasion.
Si podía provocarse una invasión.
Without American air support or resupply, the invasion force was outnumbered and outgunned. Within 72 hours, the invaders were either captured or dead.
Yo no me di cuenta de que esta misión ya estaba resultando imposible.
I did not realize that the mission was impossible until the last day, almost at the end.
Porque teníamos un exceso de
We trusted in our allies. We never thought they would forsake us or abandon us. We didn't think that they could betray the commitment they had with us.
Jack Kennedy was devastated by the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs, and he said it was a fiasco. He was not accustomed to failure in politics or in life. And he was more distraught than I'd ever seen him. How could I have been so stupid, he said.
Castro had survived and humiliated Kennedy. The CIA was told to think again.
Our job was to start to come up with new plans, not a Bay of Pigs type plans, but new plans to, quote, get rid of Castro and the Castro regime, unquote.
Everything was suggested, from assassination to spraying LSD into a television studio to make it seem as if Fidel had gone mad. Whatever they tried, Castro took in his stride. More secure within his own country, sought to export revolution to the rest of Latin America. Alarmed by this prospect, America kept up the pressure on Castro. In the spring of 1962, a practice invasion of a Caribbean island was mounted by 40,000 American Marines.
We did that purposely to make Castro pay more attention to that than causing trouble in Latin and Central America. But the Cubans and the Russians, they told us later, believed that the United States really did intend to attack Cuba, and therefore Castro kept saying, I need some help.
Castro's pleas inspired the Soviet leader Khrushchev to make a daring offer. He had boasted to the world of Russia's nuclear strength, but in reality, he knew just how limited his long-range missile force really was. But he did have medium-range nuclear missiles.
From the territory of the Soviet Union, they couldn't possibly reach the territory of the USA. But deployed on Cuba, they would become strategic nuclear weapons. That meant, in practical terms, we had a chance to narrow the differences between our forces.
I immediately appreciated the strategic importance of the presence of those missiles in Cuba. By that time, the Americans had already transported similar missiles to Turkey. I thought, if we expected the Soviets to fight on our behalf, to run risks for us, and even involve themselves in a war for our sake, it would be immoral and cowardly on our part to refuse to accept the presence of those missiles here.
In July 1962, under the nose of the Americans, the first of 150 Soviet ships, loaded with heavily disguised nuclear missiles and over 40,000 troops, sailed for Cuba.
The Americans just didn't notice that we managed to deliver not one, but 43,000 people there, plus the equipment, weapons, and everything necessary for the installation work. We put all the cars, trucks, and tractors on the top. All the military equipment was hidden under the decks.
CIA agents in Cuba reported that Russian troops and missile trailers had been seen in the streets of Havana. Washington dismissed the reports as rumor.
I saw those weird weapons, and then I said to my friend Pablo, Pablo, how powerful are these weird weapons? And he answered, these are nuclear missiles. So I thought, oh, really powerful. They just put them here, out in the open.
But the CIA had noticed the increase in Soviet ships heading for Cuba. On October the 14th, a U-2 spy plane was ordered to fly across the island to try to discover what was going on. The next morning, the Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington started analyzing the pictures that the U-2 had taken.
We're looking at the photography, and we spot objects that are foreign to the environment. And we kept looking, and we said, this is an SS-4 ballistic missile site. So working with the photo interpreters, we became convinced that this was it.
The Soviets had never put any nuclear weapons outside the Soviet borders. And we didn't think they'd do it, you know. The truth of the matter is that it never dawned on us that they would take that kind of risk.
At 8:45 a.m. on October the 16th, the CIA informed Kennedy that without any doubt there were Soviet missiles in Cuba. The president called his advisors to the White House.
We didn't spend a great deal of time wondering why the Soviets were doing this, because why they had done it, for whatever reason they had done it in a surreptitious way, lying to the United States through a variety of messages and messengers that they were only putting defensive weapons into Cuba, and those weapons constituted a clear and present danger to our security.
The missiles in Cuba made the Americans more vulnerable than ever before. The Russians were so close, could strike without warning.
The first strike would have knocked out all the American air bases, bomber bases, all the American missile bases, and all American cities except Seattle, which was out of their range. But Washington, D.C., New York City, Dallas would have all gone under the hammer.
We talked about the possibility of an airstrike, which was, at one time or another, almost everybody's first choice upon first thought, to knock out the missiles. We talked about an invasion of Cuba, which was always the preferred choice. Go in and take Cuba away from Castro and rid the island of communism, while at the same time getting rid of these missiles. A diplomatic approach, either bilaterally or through the United Nations. A blockade, or quarantine as it later came to be called. No decision was made at that first meeting, but if a vote had been taken there, airstrike was probably number one on everybody's list.
Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and closest advisor, became concerned that if America's might was used without warning against a small island, world opinion would turn against them.
Robert Kennedy, rightfully in my opinion, drew the analogy that it would be regarded by the world as a bombing of Cuba, of bases in Cuba, comparable to the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese in 1941. And he said, I don't think I want my brother to become another Tojo.
As the arguments continued, the Soviet foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, and the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin, kept a long-standing engagement at the White House.
The president raised the question of the increasing tension between our two countries in connection with the Soviet deliveries of weapons. The president said, "We're worried about it because it's connected with our own safety and security." Gromyko told him, just as I was told to say, that all our deliveries, Mr. President, are of a defensive nature. If you don't intend to invade Cuba, you shouldn't worry, because all the weapons are defensive.
It was a clear intent to deceive. If the U.S. were not to respond to Soviet deception, how would this influence the attitude of our NATO allies? How would they view the U.S. guarantee of their security? And how would it influence the future behavior of the Soviet Union? If they got by deception once, couldn't they do it again?
For the next 2 days, Kennedy stayed away, keeping up with a congressional election campaign. In Washington, his advisors tried to come up with a solution.
There were no good solutions. Every solution was full of holes and risks. It was the only time during my 3 years in the White House that I would wake up in the middle of the night agonizing over what was the right approach, what would work, what would not blow up the world.
A conclusion was reached, not to bomb, but to blockade. The Navy would stop and search all ships heading for Cuba. They called it a quarantine.
It was believed that the quarantine would convey to Khrushchev the determination of the president to see that those missiles were removed without stimulating a military response.
But in case the quarantine didn't work, preparations were made for airstrikes, and a massive American invasion force was made ready. President Kennedy was in Chicago. Now he was needed in Washington. The press were growing suspicious.
I was called by President Kennedy at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he said, "Come to my room." And he still had his bathrobe on, and he said, "Here's something I'm writing for you. You're going to hold a press conference to announce it."
The assistant White House physician, Dr. George Berkeley, noticed that the president's voice was very husky. This morning, when he examined the president, he found the president had developed a slight temperature and that he was suffering from a minor upper respiratory ailment. The president therefore canceled his schedule for the rest of today and tomorrow and has returned to Washington and the White House.
About halfway to Washington, I suddenly found myself alone with Kennedy in the front part of the airplane. I said, "Mr. President, you're not sick. What the hell's going on?" He said to me, "You're going to find out as soon as you land in Washington, and then grab your balls."
Good morning, everyone. An unusual flurry of top-secret military and diplomatic activity over the weekend has Washington guessing today that a major move in American foreign policy may be imminent. The speculation centers on the Caribbean and possible action against Cuba.
That afternoon, the Soviet ambassador was called to an urgent meeting with Secretary of State Dean Rusk.
Rusk said, "You are delivering missiles to Cuba. We have aerial reconnaissance photographs. This is a threat to our security, and we cannot possibly allow it. In 1 hour's time, at 7 p.m., the President will make a radio and television appeal to the American people, where he will describe the situation. At the same time, he wants you to pass the message on to Khrushchev."
At 7 o'clock, Kennedy announced to the world for the first time the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba, and that a blockade was now in force.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction.
The first response from Moscow came the next morning. Khrushchev was not going to back down.
Kennedy spoke about quarantine, and that sounded as something not very precise, perhaps not a blockade as it actually was. So the first reactions were pretty tough from the Soviet side.
Denouncing the United States arms quarantine against Cuba as a step toward world thermonuclear war, the Soviet Union today ordered its armed forces into a state of combat readiness, and forces of the Warsaw Pact, the communist counterpart of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, immediately followed suit.
As the superpowers prepared for conflict, Cuba announced a combat alarm. Over 250,000 people stood by to repel an American invasion.
We felt the danger. This was war. The country could be invaded at any time by the Americans.
If they invaded our country, I was convinced it would create the grave risk of the U.S. taking the second step of carrying out a nuclear airstrike against the Soviet Union.
The American fleet now encircled Cuba. The Soviet ships stayed on course. With confrontation imminent, Kennedy wanted direct contact with Moscow. He sent his brother Robert to meet in secret with the Soviet ambassador.
He said, "Did your government instruct the captains to turn the ships back home because Kennedy introduced the quarantine?" I said, "No. Our captains have no such orders. And as far as I'm aware, they are instructed to go on to Cuba." According to international law, you have no right to stop our ships in the open sea. You cannot draw an imaginary line which cannot be crossed. It is against the law. He replied, "Well then, I don't know where we are heading."
Pentagon, the United States is ready to sink every communist bloc ship headed for Cuba which refuses to stop and be searched under the blockade. Further, force will be used if necessary to stop and search any ship of any nation bound for Cuba.
I think that was the moment that really was the heart stopper. I recall being in the newsroom, just waiting for that next bulletin and almost literally trying to type with my fingers crossed.
Let's check over at the Pentagon with Charles von Fremd on that. Chuck, is there any late information about the position of those Soviet ships or what might be happening to them?
Walter, we haven't heard a word for several hours now as to when the confrontation between U.S. vessels and the Soviet ships will come about.
Nerves were being stretched to breaking point. People tried to prepare for a possible nuclear holocaust. A wave of panic buying swept across America.
We have a utility room where the furnaces are, and we were wondering whether we could make that into a bomb shelter of some form. We were learning for the first time the time that we would have after the explosion before the fumes, the killing heat and so forth would reach us.
The Soviet leaders had tried to keep the crisis from their people, but the news was getting out.
The people felt the breath of war and were tense. I remember my parents felt doomed. They understood war would not be like it was before, that it would be a war with atomic bombs.
This is a special report from CBS News.
Well, at its beginning, this day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict between Soviet vessels and American warships on the sea lanes leading to Cuba. But there has been no confrontation as far as we know, and some hope has been generated by suggestions of negotiation.
Almost at the last moment, the missile ships appeared to have slowed down or altered course. That evening, as Kennedy dined with friends at the White House, a toast was proposed to celebrate. Kennedy declined. The game, he said, was hardly over. At 9:24 p.m., the State Department received a letter from Khrushchev for the president. Khrushchev rejected all of Kennedy's demands. The missiles already in Cuba were being prepared for action. For the first time in its history, America's Strategic Air Command moved to Defense Condition 2. The next step, would be war. Just after dawn on the morning of the 25th, Kennedy ordered the interception of the Bucharest, a ship carrying Soviet oil. He knew there was no possibility of an oil tanker carrying missiles, but it was a signal to Khrushchev that he was deadly serious. That afternoon at the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson confronted his Soviet counterpart, Ambassador Zorin.
All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation.
I am not a question that is put to me in the fashion which probably does. In due course, sir, you will have it.
Soviet ambassador prevaricated. The U-2 photographs were brought into the meeting for the world to see. With work continuing on the missile sites in Cuba, the build-up of U.S. invasion forces in Florida increased. The Americans prepared for conventional combat. They were unaware that the Soviet forces were equipped with short-range tactical missiles tipped with atomic warheads, ready to annihilate any invader.
If they'd started an invasion using the Marines or the airborne forces, the losses would have been enormous. We would have fought to the last soldier, the last bullet. There was nowhere to retreat to.
On the 26th of October, at a meeting with the Soviet military commander, I was informed about the state of the missiles. He told me, the air regiment is ready. The surface-to-air missiles are ready. The tactical nuclear missile unit is ready. Missiles ready.
On October the 26th, with tension increasing, Kennedy received a telegram from Khrushchev.
The most important paragraph in it is, Mr. President, Mr. Kennedy, you and I are like two men pulling on a rope with a knot in the middle. The harder we pull, the tighter the knot until it will have to be cut with a sword. Why don't we both let up the pressure and maybe we can untie the knot?
Khrushchev went on to offer that if the United States declared that they wouldn't invade Cuba, the necessity of the presence of our military specialists in Cuba will disappear. At last, it looked as if cooler heads were prevailing. The next morning, everything changed. Khrushchev tried to push for a better deal. He demanded a trade, his missiles in Cuba for U.S. missiles in Turkey.
Khrushchev thought that if the withdrawal from Turkey could be incorporated in a general agreement between the two sides, that would look very good for the Soviet Union. Much even better than a simple decision by the United States not to attack Cuba.
President Kennedy was prepared to take the American missiles out of Turkey. But they were part of America's contribution to NATO, and he could offer Khrushchev no promises. As Kennedy considered the options, he received news that the crisis had escalated again. In continued American reconnaissance, a U-2 spy plane overflew a Soviet anti-aircraft site in the east of Cuba. This time, the Soviet commander gave the order to launch a surface-to-air missile against it.
The division commander, Lieutenant Colonel Gerchikov, was given the order to liquidate the target. If we hadn't shot down the plane which had photographed all of our bases, it would have enabled the enemy to destroy us. That would have meant we had not fulfilled our mission. We would have betrayed our motherland.
The kind of standby plan was if a U-2 was shot down, we would immediately bomb that SAM site out of existence. President Kennedy canceled that order. He said, don't bomb that anti-aircraft site. I want time to exchange with Khrushchev.
A war appeared imminent. A first strike might take place at any time. I said to myself, if Cuba is in such an unfortunate war, we will disappear from the map.
Castro sent a message to Khrushchev. He said a US attack was just hours away, and once launched, the Soviet Union should retaliate immediately with an annihilating strike. In Washington, Kennedy was still trying to avoid World War.
Bobby Kennedy had this brilliant idea. He said, let's pick out of the Khrushchev cable the things we like and pretend that the rest isn't there. Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy crafted this answer to Khrushchev that did just that. It ignored the shoot down of the U-2. It ignored the broadcast from Moscow that was very hawkish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And just, we said, we understand what you are proposing, and then we listed the things we liked.
There was little confidence that this ploy would work. Plans for the invasion continued.
The tension on Saturday night was extraordinary because it was going to be the meeting where we were going to decide what time the next day we were going to invade Cuba, or was it going to be later, where we're going to be bombing those areas. And Kennedy started the meeting by saying, listen, all of you have not been home for at least 6-7 days. I want all of you to go home tonight, come back tomorrow morning, Sunday morning, and we'll make the decision Sunday morning.
They left the White House fearful that America could soon be engulfed in a nuclear war, a war that once started might be impossible to stop.
It was a perfectly beautiful night, as fall nights are in Washington. I walked out of the President's Oval Office, and as I walked out, I thought I might never live to see another Saturday night.
Kennedy sent his brother to another meeting with the Soviet ambassador.
He came to me and said, the situation is very tense. Your missiles have just shot down our plane. Our generals demand that we fight back. If we start bombing, you will start to fight back. What can we do? I said, what about Turkey? He thought for a while and said, you know, if that's the only condition which prevents us from striking a deal, then I'm authorized by the President to say that we agree to it.
We could not take them out under threat. We could not take them out unilaterally because they were NATO bases. But he had our assurance that they would be gone provided it was not done on a quid pro quo basis. And therefore, the Russians could not talk about it.
And that was, I would say, the last thing that led to the decision to accept Kennedy's terms, that he would be willing to guarantee that there would be no attack on Cuba, but that the Soviet Union should withdraw all offensive weapons from Cuba.
Khrushchev, fearing that this might be the last chance to escape war, rushed a message accepting Kennedy's terms to Radio Moscow. It was broadcast to the world.
The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
Radio Moscow at 9 o'clock this morning. Mr. Khrushchev crating up his missiles and shipping them home.
The first news I heard on Sunday morning when I woke up was this broadcast from Khrushchev over the open air that Soviet missiles were to be withdrawn under inspection and the crisis was over. I could hardly believe my ears.
This is the day we have every reason to believe when the world came out from under the most terrible threat of nuclear holocaust since the end of World War II.
Nosotros realmente nos sentimos indignados.
We were irate. How did we learn about this? Through the radio, on the morning of the 28th. They broadcast that an agreement had been reached between the Soviet Union and the United States, that Kennedy was offering Khrushchev a guarantee. It really was a disgraceful agreement. It never crossed my mind they would do anything like this.
The whole world was under the impression that Khrushchev had lost because he'd given in to the pressure of a strong president, that he'd taken everything out of Cuba but got nothing in return. No one knew about the agreement regarding the missiles in Turkey. If you ask who won or who lost, I'd say neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev.
Under close American surveillance, Soviet ships took the missiles back home.
There is no question that if it hadn't been solved, we had invaded Cuba, we would have been in a nuclear war. And the number of people who would have been killed around the world in that nuclear war would have been absolutely disastrous. That was the biggest crisis of the 20th century. And the fact that Kennedy solved it with Khrushchev is absolutely important because then we were moving into a totally different world.